The hospital hallways were always busy. Doctors rushed past with clipboards. Nurses called out to each other across the front desk. Machines beeped. Trolleys rolled. Phones rang without stopping. It was the kind of place where noise was constant and silence was rare. But somehow, in the middle of all of that, there was one woman who moved through it all like still water. Her name was Margaret Cole. Everyone at St. Raphael's General Hospital simply called her Nurse Cole. She was 53 years old, with silver streaks running through her dark brown hair and soft lines around her eyes that came from decades of smiling at people who were afraid. She had worked at that hospital for 27 years. She knew every corner of the building. She knew which elevator was slowest. She knew which vending machine always got stuck on the third row. She knew the names of the janitors, the kitchen staff, the parking attendants, and the security guards at every entrance. But most importantly, she knew her patients. Nurse Cole worked in the long-term recovery ward, which was a quieter section of the hospital where patients stayed for weeks or sometimes months at a time. These were people healing from serious surgeries, difficult injuries, or complicated illnesses. They did not get many visitors. They did not get much noise or excitement. What they got, more often than not, was Nurse Cole. She came in early every single morning. She checked on each patient before her shift officially began. She adjusted blankets. She refilled water glasses without being asked. She sat beside beds and listened to stories about grandchildren and old jobs and places people used to live. She remembered what she heard. The next day, she would ask a follow-up question. The day after that, she would remember the answer. For the patients in that ward, she was more than a nurse. She was company. She was warmth. She was the one face they could count on seeing every single morning. One particular group of patients had been transferred to St. Raphael's from a military rehabilitation center, about 2 hours away. The center had experienced flooding in its lower floors, and several of its patients had needed temporary placement while repairs were carried out. 8 men and 4 women, all of them active or recently retired members of the armed forces, were assigned to the long-term recovery ward. They arrived in the evening, quiet and guarded, in the way that people are when they find themselves somewhere unfamiliar. Some of them had serious physical injuries. A few were recovering from surgeries on their legs and backs. Others carried injuries that did not show on the outside, but weighed just as heavily on the inside. They were polite to the staff, but kept mostly to themselves. A couple of them barely spoke at all. Nurse Cole arrived the next morning before 6 o'clock, the same as always. She walked into the ward, looked at the new faces, and did not treat them any differently than she treated anyone else. She introduced herself calmly. She asked each one their name, and she used it immediately. She asked how they had slept. She asked if the room was too cold or too warm. She asked if there was anything they needed. Small questions, simple questions, but she asked them looking directly at each person, and she waited for the actual answer instead of moving on before it came. One of the patients, a man named Sergeant Daniel Rowe, watched her with quiet curiosity that first morning. He was 38 years old and had served for 15 years before an injury during a training exercise had left him with a serious spinal condition. He had been in and out of medical facilities for 2 years by then. He had met a lot of nurses, a lot of doctors, a lot of staff members who were perfectly professional and perfectly distant. He had grown used to being treated like a file number. Nurse Cole was different. He could not explain exactly why at first, but something about the way she carried herself, unhurried and genuinely present, made him feel less like a case and more like a person. Over the following days, she learned things about each of her 12 new patients. She learned that one of the women, a young corporal named Priya, loved crossword puzzles, but could not hold a pen easily due to her hand injury. Nurse Cole started reading the clues aloud and writing down the answers for her each morning. She learned that one of the older men, a retired colonel named Frank, had trouble sleeping and felt calmer when someone talked to him for a few minutes after lights out. She began stopping by his room last on her evening rounds and spending a few quiet minutes chatting about nothing in particular. She learned that Sergeant Rowe had a younger sister named Alice who lived across the country and called every Sunday. She learned that he had not told his sister how serious his condition was because he did not want her to worry. She did not push him on it. She simply listened and let him carry it the way he chose to carry it. What Nurse Cole did not know And what none of the patients told her was that word was spreading quietly among them about her. In the way that people who have spent years in close quarters with others learn to read character quickly, they had each taken notice of her. They talked about her during the long afternoon hours when the ward was slow. They mentioned specific things she had done: the corporal with the crossword, the colonel and his late-night conversation, the way she remembered that one patient was allergic to a certain soap, and made sure the correct kind was always available, without ever having to be reminded. They were not accustomed to being looked after that way, not in a hospital setting. It meant something to them. 2 weeks passed. The repairs at the Military Rehabilitation Center were going well, and it was confirmed that the 12 patients would be transferred back within the coming days. There was a quiet relief about returning to a familiar place, but there was also something else underneath it that was harder to name. Then, on a Wednesday morning, Nurse Cole arrived at work and found a note in her box from hospital administration. She was asked to come to the department head's office before beginning her rounds. She folded the note, tucked it into her pocket, and went upstairs. The meeting was brief. The department head, a tired-looking man named Dr. Ellison, who managed these conversations with the particular awkwardness of someone who disliked them, informed her that the hospital was undergoing a staffing restructure. Budget constraints had led to a review of all senior nursing positions, and her role in the long-term recovery ward was being eliminated at the end of the month. She would be offered a position in a different department, with reduced hours and reduced pay, or she could accept a severance package and leave. He said all of this looking mostly at the papers on his desk. Nurse Cole sat across from him and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 2 practical questions about the timeline and the paperwork. He answered them. She thanked him for letting her know, stood up, shook his hand, and left the office. She went back downstairs. She completed her full rounds. She refilled water glasses. She read crossword clues to the young corporal. She sat with the colonel for 10 minutes before the day got busy. She checked on every single patient in the ward, the 12 military patients and all the others, and she did her job the same way she had done it for 27 years. She did not tell anyone what had happened in that office. By the afternoon, however, a member of the administrative staff had mentioned the restructure to someone at the front desk. In a hospital, information moves almost as fast as it does in a military unit. By early evening, the news had reached the long-term recovery ward. Sergeant Rowe heard it from a younger nurse who mentioned it without thinking while checking his chart. He said nothing in response. He waited until she had left the room. Then he lay still in his bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling. That evening, he asked one of the other patients, a quiet man named Private Torres, if he had heard. Torres had. They spoke in low voices for several minutes. Then Torres spoke to the colonel. The colonel spoke to 2 of the women in the ward. By 10 o'clock that night, all 12 of them knew. None of them slept particularly well. The next morning, Nurse Cole arrived at her usual time and began her usual routine. She noticed that the ward felt slightly different, a kind of charged stillness that she had not felt there before. A few of the patients were already awake and sitting up when she came in, which was unusual. She smiled, said good morning, and went about her work. She was in the middle of checking a medication schedule at the nurse's station when she heard it. Footsteps. More than one set, coming down the hallway with a particular rhythm that was different from the soft shuffle of hospital shoes. She looked up. Through the glass panel beside the ward entrance, she could see people approaching. Not just 12, more than 12. Many more. They came through the door steadily, in ones and twos and small clusters. Some were in uniform. Some were in civilian clothes but carried themselves in a way that made their background unmistakable. Some moved slowly, with canes or crutches. Some moved carefully, favoring one side or the other. The 12 patients from her ward came first, those who were mobile enough, and behind them came others. Former colleagues, said one of them quietly. Friends from the rehabilitation center who had made the 2-hour drive. People who had heard from people who had heard from people. In total, there were more than 20 of them standing in the hallway and spilling into the ward. Sergeant Rowe stepped forward. He was standing without his usual stiff guardedness, and when he looked at Nurse Cole, his expression was something she had not seen on his face before. It was open. He said that they had heard what was happening. He said they had talked it over and decided that they could not leave without saying something. Not because they expected it to change anything, not because they thought a speech would fix a budget decision, but because it was right. Because she had treated every single one of them as though they mattered as people, not as patients, not as cases, not as temporary occupants of a bed. And in a life that had taken all of them through some very hard places, that kind of treatment was not something any of them took lightly. He said her name carefully when he addressed her. Not Nurse Cole. Margaret. He told her that she had given him something during those 2 weeks that he had not felt in a long time. He called it dignity. He said it quietly and without any particular drama, the way someone says a word when they mean it exactly. One by one, some of the others spoke too. The young corporal, Priya, said that those morning crossword sessions had been the best part of her days. The colonel, Frank, said that their late-night conversations had helped him more than any prescription he had been given for his sleep. Others said smaller things, specific things, the kind of things only someone who had been paying close attention could have noticed being done for them. And then something happened that no one had planned exactly, but that seemed to arrive naturally. One of the soldiers near the back stood straight. Then another did. Then another. Until all of them, every single one who was physically able, was standing upright and still. It was not a formal military salute in the strict ceremonial sense. It was something more personal than that. It was the posture of people who knew how to show respect when words were not quite enough. They held it for several long seconds. Nurse Cole stood in the middle of all of it and said nothing for a moment. She looked around the room slowly, at each face. Her eyes were bright. Then she said thank you. She said it simply and without any performance. She said that she had loved this work every single day for 27 years, and that the reason she had loved it was standing right in front of her. Later that afternoon, Dr. Ellison received a letter. It had been written that morning and signed by all 20-plus individuals who had come to the ward. It was polite and clear, and it laid out, in specific terms, what Nurse Cole had meant to those patients, and why her role was not an administrative redundancy, but an essential human service that no budget spreadsheet could properly measure. Dr. Ellison read it twice. Whether it was the letter, or the attention the gathering had drawn from other staff members who had their own stories about Nurse Cole, or simply the visibility of the moment, something shifted in the administrative conversation over the following days. The restructure was reviewed again. Her position was not eliminated. She was still there the following Monday morning, arriving before 6, refilling water glasses, asking how people had slept. The 12 military patients were transferred back to their rehabilitation center a few days later. On the morning they left, each one stopped by the nurses' station before departure. No speeches this time, just a handshake, or a nod, or a few quiet words. Sergeant Rowe was the last to leave. He stopped at the doorway and looked back at her. He said he would remember her. She told him she would remember him too. She used his name when she said it. He nodded once, turned, and walked down the hallway. Nurse Cole watched him go. Then she picked up her chart, turned toward the ward, and started her rounds. The hallway was busy again. Trolleys rolled. Phones rang. Machines beeped. Everything was exactly as it always was. And she moved through it all like still water,